Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
All right, everybody. Welcome along. Let me find where all of my buttons are. Getting a little loud. Hey, Martin. Hey, Timothy. Good evening. Good evening to all and sundry. Hey, Jean. Hey, Denise. Hey, Susan. Hey, Laura. A tub of super glue right under my foot. That could have been a disaster. Hey, Chuck. Hey, Maureen, Gladys, Deb, hey, Dad. Hey, Ann. Mona and Heather. And Emily and Jenny. Hey, Carrie over on YouTube. Hey, Limons. Hey, Dory, Karen, and Cindy. Hey, Laura. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Darlene on YouTube. Hey, Rose. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Trish. Hey, Kathleen at Band Rehearsal. My band's new single is out now at a streaming service near you. Hey, Carolina on YouTube. Another single out by the end of the month, and then the album next month. I'll put up a TikTok pretty soon. Hey, Emily. Hey, Lori. I mean, my music making on the side doesn't have much to do with this stuff. It's just something I do for, like, an art project. But I'm pretty proud of this one. Hey, Jane. Welcome back. Hey, Lemons. Hey, Bridget. And Bridget's mom. Hey, Steve. Hey, James on YouTube. A lot of people coming in on YouTube tonight. Hey, Janine. Glad to have you right place at the right time. Hey, Lauren. Welcome, everybody. Hey, Mom. Evening, Victoria in Washington. I know Miles is around here someplace. He popped up a little bit on the library gig that I had a couple hours ago. Well, an hour ago. Hey, Natalie. Hey, Joanne. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Ann. That was fine. Cannibalism tours? I don't know about that. And I know there's going to be a lot of Dahmer-related stuff, demand coming up, but I don't do that new stuff. Hey, Bob. Hey, Greg. Hey, Megan. Hey, Marie. Yeah, I know there's going to be a lot of demand for Dahmer stuff, but I'm too much of a smart aleck on things. Being smart alecky on stuff that recent is dicey business. Cindy, I'm with you. I'll just stick with pie. And not from that Sweeney Todd fellow either. Those are probably the worst pies in London. That may be my first Sweeney Todd reference on here. I know some of you like watch for the Broadway stuff. Somebody let that slip. Hey, Natalie. Hey, Doreen, we wish you could have been there too. Oh yeah, I'm sure the victims are pretty upset about that. They've made that pretty clear for years. I almost got a nasty letter from a descendant of a Holmes victim. But his understanding of the case was not nearly as good as he thought it was. And plus he told me that I was dismissing the wonderful work of the Chicago police, which is a big red flag. And not any based in fact whatsoever. It's not random if we're talking cannibalism. It's part of why the Lutgert Sausage Factory murder is so difficult to tell. It's a popular story in Chicago, but you mention sausage and murder, people expect somebody to get eaten. And nobody did. And Natalie, that much more so in the 1890s, too. That what I've often said is those guys couldn't have caught COVID at an indoor anti-mask rally. I mean, this 1890s police work was not a profession, even to the extent that it is now. Bye, Cassidy. Okay. Big Bang Pie. I have not been to Big Bang Pie. Bang Bang Pie. I've been by, but it's never open when I'm there. If it's the one I'm thinking of. It's not usually necessary to travel 45 minutes just for pie. Hey, Karen on YouTube. Well, to the extent that it was a profession at all back then, there was no real training. It wasn't a profession, it was just a job that you signed up for. Hey, Vicky. Oh, thanks for coming out. Hey, Dawn. Trish, glad you had a good time. I loved Mystericon, too. It was so much fun. I don't know where the cats are right now. I'll have to get Miles before we close out anyway. He's got to make his appearance. Natalie, I think that's true, but it can be overstated sometimes. Hey, Ian. Johan, none of yours. Thanks, Katie. Hey, Donna.
Benny Goodman goes away.
Hey, Grandma Bell.
Gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
James, I am drinking some Bell Mead that the Mysterium brought me at the con from David. I believe. I hope I'm not messing that up. Hey, Amy. Hey, Beck and Alex. Hey, Tara. Yeah, this is Benny live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. We usually open with this or some other 1930s Chicago recording. Hey, Paula in Wisconsin. Evening, Gene. And hey, Janine. Johan. Maybe. Hey, Bridget. Harvest Cosmo. That sounds good. You can put a harvest in pretty much any food, and I won't want to eat it or drink it. The word harvest, fire roasted. I'm a sucker for such things. Do I have Halloween Big Band? There is a Halloween-themed episode of Benny Goodman on Camel Caravan out there someplace. It comes and goes online. I've got it on a hard drive someplace. I should start playing that one. Hey, Dom. Hello, everybody. Hey, Daryl in Wisconsin. Got so many Wisconsiners tonight, I feel like I'd have a brandy old-fashioned on me. Alex and Beck, as you may know, got engaged during the boat tour. Arlie, I don't know if I'd say collector, but I do happen to have several vinyl albums right in reach of me right now. Are you hip to this band, The Paranoid Style? If you're not listening to The Paranoid Style, go do so immediately. Then I got some Zevon and
Rosetta.
Some Eric Dolphy. I wouldn't say collector, but I got a couple shelves worth of records. Angie, can't wait to have you on Saturday's tour. Harvest Malort, I'd probably drink it. I don't think Malort's that bad, honestly. We joke about it a lot, but it kind of reminds me of clove cigarettes. Hey, Jenna. Hey, Kathleen. Everybody, we're going to give Benny Goodman another tune here before we get started properly. Oh, I do love Eric Dolphy's bass clarinet doubling with the upright bass. Ah. Hey, Kelly. Yeah, Malort, we build it up to be so bad that when you actually try it, it's not usually that bad. Okay. 2 ounces of vodka, 1 ounce Cointreau, 1 ounce apple cider, 1 ounce cranberry cocktail, splash of lemon. I think I have all of those things. I could do that. Well, I may not have any just plain vodka. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Katie. Hey, Eleanor. And hey, Kathleen. Kathleen and Joanne were on their honeymoon on the tour. I didn't know Mysterious Chicago was going to become a destination for queer weddings, but I am here for it. Wonderful side effect. Asked that I not smoke clove here. Well, I don't happen to have a pack of those still in storage. All the goths smoked them back in the day. They're harder to get now, they're not the same though. We'll let Benny Goodman finish this up. Linda, glad you enjoyed Grave Robbing 101. I just did that for the Mountain Prospect Library about an hour ago. So yeah, tonight is my 3rd night in a row with 2 gigs straight. So I've done the zoo tour twice a night the last couple of nights. Tonight's 2 virtual gigs.
Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel.
All right, that is music from Benny Goodman, presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. He's wrapping up. That means it is time for us to get started properly. So welcome along, everybody. Welcome to my messy living room. I've been so busy this time of month, I don't have a whole lot of time to clean up around the desk. But I do have time to do an awful lot of tours, which is what I love doing anyway. So welcome along, everybody. For those of you new out there, I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book. H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, which will be the subject of next week's virtual talk. It'll be over on the effing Chicago Facebook page, but the same YouTube and Twitch as usual. Murder Maps USA, new from Thames and Hudson. Ghost of Chicago, now a rare collector's item. I found a few of them that went at Mystericon. I planned to come up with some way to distribute them, but I didn't give Mandy specific instructions, so she just put them out with the other books, which is probably the best way to do it. Graceland Cemetery, the new one, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. This is the one that I've been hyping up on half the shows on WGN lately. We've got Graceland tours all month long. There's going to be 2 of them this weekend, 2 of them next weekend. The afternoon one next weekend still is very, very wide open, so feel free to go grab a ticket for that now while you're thinking about it. But all right, everybody, I got my start doing ghost hunting tours in Chicago back nearly 20 years ago now, back when you could turn on the TV and there'd be 9 ghost hunting shows on any given channel at any given time. So what we're doing today is I've done the virtual ghost tour many times. I'm sure I'll do it again before the end of this month, this being October and all. But really, we're focusing a little bit more on North Side stuff, specifically North Shore, the very northern edge of Chicago, up into the northern suburbs that go along the shores of Old Lake Michigan, where the hawk winds blow so cold. And then, if there is time, I'll delve in a little bit into some of the other stories that just occur around the north side of Chicago. But Sheridan Road, the one that winds in a twist twisting manner around the lakeshore, through Evanston, up through all of the other streets, up through all the other suburbs, about a block off of the lake itself, was once upon a time known as the most haunted street in the Chicagoland area. There were multiple large newspaper articles covering all of the strange history and the strange stories of Sheridan Road. This is one from 1896. There was another big one in 1902, Chicago's Road of Mysteries, where ghosts hold sway. And here, this is a very interesting picture just for the historical stuff. This is the old tower in Winnetka. There's still a tower road up there that most people assume is because it leads kinda to the lighthouse. I lost that word for a second. They also have a building next to that they label Holmes Castle. This is not the same as the Holmes Castle that they've been talking about 5 or 6 or 7 years before down in Englewood. This is the one that was up in Wilmette that he built for his wife. He would very rarely have been at this place himself, but it's a really good picture of what it looked like at the time. It's about as good a one as I know. We also see a picture of the lakeshore that's just where the ghost walks, and the ruins of the Wilson home. There were a couple of versions of the Wilson home. It was still standing at the time. They just moved it a little bit from where it was then. So we're going to sort of make our way north from right on the edge. Now, Calvary Cemetery in Evanston is just barely in Evanston. In fact, the blocks below it actually got absorbed by Chicago. Officially, this part of Chicago ends when you get to Howard Avenue, but the couple of blocks above that were cut off from the rest of Evanston by the cemetery and the railroad tracks were only too happy to get absorbed by Chicago because they were too cut off from Evanston at the time. So, I'm a little bit ahead of myself there. Here we are at the edge of Calvary Cemetery, which charmingly goes right up to the lake. One time, Teddy Roosevelt got lost in a carriage, or the carriage he was in got lost. They ended up in the middle of the cemetery, at which point he shouted, "We have arrived at Armageddon!" Being a little overdramatic, but quite possibly ready to do battle with 4 horsemen, that being him, all right. But this is said to be the haunt of a ghost called Seaweed Charlie, who is seen emerging from the lake and walking across Lakeshore Drive, or this is Sheridan Road by now, it connects to Lakeshore Drive, walking through the gates of the old cemetery. This dates back to the 1950s or so. It is said to be a guy covered in seaweed, usually dressed up in military outfit, and therefore generally thought to be the ghost of a guy named Laverne Neighbors. Laverne Neighbors was piloting a ship, an FH-1 Phantom, coming out of the Glenview Naval Air Base. And in 1951, he was out practicing when he had some kind of a problem. He was crashed into the water. He was able to get out onto the wings and wave for help, but eventually he sank with the ship and did not survive. Now, exactly why we call this guy Seaweed Charlie when this guy's name was Laverne is kind of a mystery. It might just be better like, well, why do we call Resurrection Mary Resurrection Mary? There's no account of that ghost where she actually says what her name is. So it might just be we call him Seaweed Charlie because it's got a better ring to it than Seaweed Laverne. Honestly, I think Seaweed Laverne would be a pretty good name for a ghost. We're also kind of assuming that the ghost must be of him, but it's worth mentioning that the plane was over around here, but a couple of people drowned while trying to salvage the plane a couple of days later. And Neighbor's body was found about a month after this, and it was eventually sent back to his hometown to be buried. Now, there's one other enduring mystery up here at Calvary Cemetery, and that is that back in the early 20th century, there was one private burial ground still allowed by the city of Chicago. It was down on Taylor Street. It's part of the Taylor Street tour now. There's an empty space there, but it used to be a Catholic school run by a group of nuns, the Sacred Heart Academy. And these were semi-cloistered nuns. They were allowed to leave the area for emergencies, but generally they stayed within the abbey. And a funeral did not count as an emergency, so they were all just buried on the grounds until they moved everything up to the north side. And when they decided to move all of the bodies, they found that 2 of the nuns, including Mother Gathrow, Mother Galway and Mother Gathrow, had been turned into stone. And the way this was described, it was like thousands of pounds of stone inside of the coffins. It wasn't just like they had petrified, they had literally turned into marble. Now, even at the time that this was first reported in 1907, there were some scientific explanations as to how this might work. This guy goes into a big, long thing about percolating a stratum to be charged with mineral ingredients and come in contact with the elephants, thus newly set free. It's all a little bit over my head, but bottom line is if they did in fact find an awful lot of adipoker, which is kind of a thing where your body turns into cheese, that it would have been an awful lot of adipoker. This was not really well documented enough that I can find that we can really necessarily say it's for sure true. But the story always says that these bodies were being moved up to Calvary Cemetery. But nobody seems to know where the Order of the Sacred Heart is there. There's a lot of headstones for various orders of nuns that are buried there, but we haven't been able to find one for these people. There's a couple of rumors of them being in other places nearby, other fenced-off cemeteries in other areas, but nothing has really panned out so far. So we're still kind of working on that one. Well, let's move on up into Wilmette. And right here on what would have been John Street at the time, we just talked about the other H.H. Holmes building. H.H. Holmes, of course, is the guy who tends to be advertised as America's first known serial killer. Best known for his activities down on the south side, where he had a 3-story building that supposedly was a hotel where he was killing people during the World's Fair. That's a little more fiction than it is fact, but he did probably kill 9 or 10 people, which is plenty of people. And at the same time, partly because he was dating lots of other women on the side, he eventually built a house up in Wilmette in the north suburbs for his wife, Myrta. Now, the official owner of the house was Minnie Williams, one of his girlfriends, who disappeared in the summer of 1893, which eventually meant that Myrta, her daughter, and her mother were kicked out of the place. They kicked and screamed and tried to stop it. There's whole anecdotes about it in the legal archives. But this was the house. By all accounts, a nice one. We have some account of the building of it because it was, you can see a lot of shingles here, but it was mostly brick. We know this because the Weber and Laban Brick Company eventually sued for non-payment. But Holmes had put Minnie Williams' name on top of the paperwork, so they were trying to sue Minnie Williams, who most likely was dead by the time they got around to it. And it does mention within the paperwork that they'd done their due diligence, but they couldn't find Minnie Williams anywhere. But Holmes lived up in this general vicinity for a while, and we can actually associate some of his haunted locations with the north side. We'll go out of the suburbs here a bit, but down near Damon, Elston, and Fullerton, which before they redid that intersection was scary enough as it was, just for traffic reasons, was this little vacant lot. It's not vacant anymore. They've built condos there now. Because, of course, they have built condos there now. But we used to take people out here on ghost tours. We started going out here really just as a historical curiosity, because we had come across this letter, this old newspaper article saying they had found another H.H. Holmes building about in this location, what at the time was called Sobieski Street. And supposedly it was the wreck of an old glass bending factory that had never actually bent any glass, but had a lot of Holmes' paperwork and receipts strewn about the place. And there's kind of a short list of things that a known serial killer might have been doing with a 150-foot-long furnace. But it was a spooky place. We couldn't really, the Holmes connection to here was a little bit shaky. About as shaky as anything else in Holmes' lore. But we did find there was this tree there that was always oozing reddish-brown gunk out of it. It's probably just iron oxide from the soil. This place had been a junkyard at one time. But still, you go to the body dump and see a black branch with blood that keeps dripping. It's going to spook you a little bit. There is also these pictures that people would get here occasionally. And this is very near the home of one of Holmes' supposed victims, a woman named Emily Van Tassel, who's a real wild card among Holmes' victims. Newspaper articles tended to change her name constantly. The 2 versions of his confession, she has a totally different name. One is Anna Van Tassad, and the other is Rosine Van Jassent. So it's a real question mark with her. There's something weird about the whole thing. There's this other, shadowy figure next to the serial killer van there. And there's one of a thing lurking behind the tree. I was standing over off to the side when they took this picture. I didn't see anything there. But that is also the tree with the black branch with blood that keeps dripping. Spooky any way you cut it. The place just kind of messed with your head. There used to be a light attached to one of the garages that would, some nights, it didn't work every night, but some nights it would go off or on every time I said the name Holmes. Then I showed it to the guy who owned the building. He just disconnected the entire thing. It wasn't powerful enough to turn the light on when it wasn't connected. Whatever the magic spell this was. We'll go back up to Wilmette, just a couple of blocks away from Holmes' house up there, where he would not have been a regular visitor. He was there, I think, about once a week during the 6 months between the time when it was finished and the time when he got out of Chicago, leaving Myrta and the little girl, Lucy, behind. But right around here on Lake Avenue, would have been the home of a woman named Mrs. Crone, who lived with her son-in-law, Frank Wheeler. But it would have been right about here. It's kind of difficult for me to triangulate because I couldn't find what the exact address was at the time. I'm not sure it really used an address in 1893. It was probably just the Crone House, Lake Avenue or something. It was still a much more rural area back then. But we do have some pictures of it. And from the side, this had been redone a little bit. Some of the ones around here would have looked about right. There's also this house over here that's pretty close. But one day, Mr. Wheeler came home and found that there was a burglar in the house. He managed to shoot the burglar dead because, this is the North Shore suburbs. This is the home of Kevin McAllister. Burglars are not treated very well in this area. But before shooting this burglar, he'd found that his mother-in-law, Mrs. Crone, was lying in a pool of blood. There were bite marks on the dead man's head, showing that there had been a really terrific struggle. Mr. Wheeler chased off a couple of other burglars down the street, and when he came back from chasing them, having not been able to catch up with them, he found that his house was on fire. Eventually, they only found a couple of charred bones left of Mrs. Crone. The house had to be rebuilt, which would also explain why it looks like it does in here. A new house was built there, but there were lots more fires in the same place. It came up quite a lot. And this was quite the story at the time. We got a whole diagram of what everything was like. Here's a diagram showing Mr. Wheeler's room, then showing his mother-in-law right across the hall, showing exactly where the body was, with a nice little diagram there. Not disturbing at all. And I'm assuming that Mr. Wheeler came under a lot of suspicion himself. The other burglars, I don't believe, were ever actually caught. Now, this being just a couple of blocks away from H.H. Holmes's house, a couple of years later, when H.H. Holmes had been arrested and they were undergoing the whole digging up of his building in Englewood, there were some rumors going around about his house in Wilmette. Some people said that it was full of just as many secret passages and strange things, and any time that Murda was seen taking out garbage, she would be aroused the suspicion of the neighbors. And at that time, a lot of people started to think, wait a minute, remember that Crone thing? Do you think that might have been Holmes? And they actually asked one of the Chicago detectives about it, Inspector Fitzpatrick, whose grave we saw briefly last week on Find a Grave Friday down at Mount Olivet. And he said, no, Holmes was a scientific killer. He would never think of killing somebody like this. You might as well just connect him with Jack the Ripper over in London. Never dreaming that somebody might actually do that a century or so later. One other thing while we're in Wilmette, over at the, across from the depot, was Mr. Van Geem's paint store. And you can see here they don't really have a particular address for Mr. Van Geem's paint store. It's just Railroad Avenue opposite the depot. That's probably what you would write. But the church where Murda went to church, well, Murda and Holmes too, I believe, was up above Van Geem's paint store before they managed to build the Methodist church around here. But Holmes would come up as an explanation anytime something strange happened for a while around the North Shore suburbs. About a year after his execution in 1896, there was a widely reported story that took place right around here, elsewhere in Evanston, kind of on the border between Evanston and Wilmette. Right on the border, really. There was a woman named Mrs. Parker who convinced her husband to dig up a space where she thought that a body was buried. Now, she was having premonitions about this, and this became quite a story. It was picked up in papers all over the country about this woman who had had a dream about a skeleton being buried and sent her husband out, and he did some digging and didn't find anything, but she kept on dreaming, so she sent him back and he dug some more, and this time he found a skeleton down there. Now, immediately people thought, okay, we're right near Wilmette. Could this have been one of the H.H. Holmes victims whose body was never found? This was widely reported in papers all over the place, but really it didn't come up in most of the Chicago papers. The Chicago Tribune did not mention it. The Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean, I believe, did not mention it. The one that covered it was the Chicago Record, which was the morning edition of the Daily News. And if you look at their edition, this is why I always trace things back to something that had a reporter on the ground. And in this case, the reporter on the ground reported a little bit differently. The way it was told in every other place, they said that the woman had been having dreams about this skeleton being buried. And the first-hand account is that she was walking around and had premonitions while she was wide awake that they would find some bones down here. But find some bones they did. and this became the great grave mystery. They found some bones, including a human skull. So when he dug up and found these bones, he ran to get the police, but later mentioned, no, I didn't find a skull in there. But newspapers reported this in great detail. It later turned out very quickly that really they were the bones of a horse. And inside of it, as soon as the detectives were called, one of them had quickly procured a human skull from Northwestern University to toss it into the pit, having already recognized that it was horse bones. So apparently one of the reporters for the Record had just written an unflattering article about him, so he thought, I'll fool him, I'll put a skull in here, and he'll announce that it was a human burial, and then he'll look like a fool. Honestly, I think the cop looked more like a fool. The skull was eventually returned to some frat house, and you might remember last week we were parked by the frat houses at Northwestern. Wonder if they've still got it. Highly doubt that they do, but frat houses in those days always had to have a skull. Like most famously, the Skull and Bones, the crypt or the tomb or whatever the hell they call it at Yale, is said to feature the skull of Geronimo. I really doubt it's original, but they don't like to talk about this kind of stuff. We'll stick around this general vicinity. Now, this story continued to get retold and reported, especially in stories about the ghosts of Sheridan Road, long after it had actually been debunked. You see this quite a bit. A story comes up, the story gets dismissed, and then when it circulates back into the public consciousness, people kind of forget that it all got explained away. And sometimes the story's even gotten wilder and wilder. It's sometimes called the Roswell effect. It also happened with H.H. Holmes. Much of the Holmes stuff got explained away early on, but then when the story came back in the public consciousness, it was all roaring back, plus it had added on several new dimensions all its own. Cover a bit more here. There's something weird's going on with my computer up here. I think I fixed it. Okay, I'll stop worrying now. While we're in Kenilworth, there's a couple of things in Kenilworth. I'm actually ahead of myself over here. Now, this is the railroad station. Kenilworth is a little pocket town in between Wilmette and Winnetka. We'll cover this just a bit. Right around Kenilworth Station, back in the 1800s, there was a guy named William Lamport. He was an early prominent resident who poisoned himself somewhere right around here, and right near the depot, wandered out to thrash around in his death throes, having poisoned himself. It was said at the time that nothing would grow on the place where the body had fallen. I don't really see any places around here where nothing is growing now. A couple places with dirt and landscaping, so I don't know, for all I know, maybe the place where they put down the wood chips, that's where nothing was growing. More likely, it doesn't really work anymore. I could not find anything to support, like any contemporary account of a guy named William Lamport even existing, let alone thrashing his way to death having poisoned himself right over here by the depot. There's actually one individual grave in the church in Kenilworth, and I finally got some access to it a while ago. It's like right in the courtyard, there's some a columbarium on the wall with memorials to and ashes of people who were members. But in the middle is a guy who was moved from Graceland Cemetery to get his own space. He and his wife, Julia, had their own space. They had pretty much a whole churchyard all to themselves. Eugene Field was a poet. He was best known for Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. They called him the poet of childhood. He also wrote a humor column for the Chicago Daily News, plus a very famous poem at the time about a dead child that's really heartbreaking to read, so we won't concern ourselves with it here. Personally, as you know, I'm most partial to his dirty poems, some of which we read on the After Hours tours now and then. There's one called Socratic Love that is generally said to be the first use of the word poop in its modern noun and verb form. At least the first published version that anybody knows of. Before that, it usually meant fart. There's also one about his wife who is buried here with him called On Julia Unlacing, talking about how much he loved it when his wife unlaced all of her corsets and farted loudly. There's really a very touching poem if you look at it from, I don't want to say a certain point of view because Aiden's holding the other room right now. But I just think this is charming that you could write a really dirty poem called Socratic Love and still end up getting a whole churchyard all to yourself. Also a poem about his son called When Willie Wet the Bed. But over on the edge of Winnetka is this nice view of the water tower that marks about where the tower itself would have been. I just showed off the tower picture earlier on. It's weird that there aren't better pictures of that are easy to find. But this leads to a whole bunch of stairs going down these bluffs to the lake, and this little section of Tower Park where the tower used to be. You see that quite a lot, places where things used to be. Here's a view of the tower. I think I got this one too large. Do I have this too large? Here's a view down the steps. There we go. But right around here, right around where that gazebo is now, is the place where a headless body was found. And you know I love a good headless body story. Love them. So, back in 1881 here in Winnetka, a bunch of kids were playing down there on the lake and saw a human head floating. It washed up onto the shore. They ran back to alert the authorities. The cops, by the time the cops came back, it was already gone. A couple of months later, they found a headless body nearby. This was a couple of months later. The body was immaculately dressed in fine German clothes, but missing his head. And it was a clean cut, probably made after death, and usually when you cut off a person's head after death, it's to disguise the identity. It had been the authorities took it and very hastily buried it in a shallow grave right in town, right about in Hubbard's Wood Park. They always referred to the area as Hubbard Wood back then. And in the grand suburban tradition, they now have a park named after the woods that used to be there. But this is, you might recognize this area. That is the store where Kevin McAllister steals a toothbrush, and this is the park where he runs through in Home Alone. But this was also said to be haunted by the headless ghost. He would have been buried right about here, but it was a very shallow grave, and a lot of people were just absolutely aghast that they hadn't made any effort whatsoever, even to root through the pockets of the corpse to try to find any identifying papers, any identifying marks. Their excuse being that, well, it smelled so bad. It smelled so bad that they just buried it in a shallow grave right in the middle of town where everybody could keep on smelling it. A letter to the editor was saying that they are inhuman up there in Winnetka. But the backlash forced the police to dig it back up. They let the clothes air out for a while before they dug through them, that it didn't really help them that much. They decided to match the body up with a head that had been found on the south side of Chicago, an old medical cadaver head, which almost certainly would not have been the right head, but they took that head, matched it to the body, and buried it out at Dunning. By then it had been smelling so bad that the newspapers all noted that whoever had to drive that corpse clear out the Dunning from Winnetka had a really unpleasant afternoon ahead of them. But this means that Winnetka was a really small town at the time. So really, I calculated at one point, the per capita rate of being buried with the wrong head in Winnetka at the time would have been 200 people per 100,000 residents. That's really not a good ratio. Now, eventually they traced the guy to a guy named Ignaz Hoff, who had been the mayor of a small town in Germany, though I don't think it was ever entirely... The identification is probably still not certain. Certainly, the murderer was never caught. The motive for the killing was never really found, and most likely he had been buried with the wrong head. I hate it when that happens. We're gonna back up just a little bit here, and just check out this section of Sheridan near Ashland, back in Evanston. Now, back in the old days, there was a country club down the road here. And in September 1903, a whole bunch of people came into that country club saying that they had seen a carriage broken down by the side of the road here on Sheridan, inside of which was a body wrapped in a winding sheet. And a couple of people said, oh yeah, I saw those guys by the side of the road and I helped them get their carriage fixed up. But then it happened over and over again. Apparently, a lot of people helped this carriage get set back up. The next day, they were trying to trace all of the funeral homes nearby, saying, was a body delivered? And nobody could figure out where this body might have been going. It had been a murder or what, and why did so many people have to fix it? It's almost like one of those old ghost stories where you go and where you fix the guy's carriage and immediately the ghost comes back. And usually at the end of these stories, it gives somebody a handsome reward for having fixed them. That doesn't seem to happen here, but they were already country club people in the North Shore suburbs. They didn't really need a reward that badly, I don't suppose. But back up where the headless specter walked, possibly right into Kevin McAllister's house, depending on just how peripatetic this headless ghost was. Headless ghosts really do tend to get around, though it would have had to cross the bridge, and they hate doing that. If we learned anything from Ichabod Crane, once you cross that bridge, my friend, the ghost is through, his power ends. But here we are down on the beach. This was said to be the haunt in the 1890s, and both of those ghost articles in 1898 and 1906 said that this was the haunt of a ghost of a woman named Annie Russell, who was the belle of the north suburbs. She had many suitors, many possible boyfriends, many people who wanted to marry her, but there was only one that she wanted. And when he rejected her, she walked down to these bluffs and threw herself into the water. Since then, her ghostly form had been seen walking up and down, wringing her hands. Now, this showed up in both of the ghost articles. Both of them gave her the same name, which is a pretty good sign because they disagreed on the names of a lot of people. And that's also very common when you go back to old ghost stories, trying to find out the exact name of who we're talking about. Tends to get lost in the telling over time. But I can't find anything to back this up. I can't find any contemporary story of a woman named Annie Russell dying here. I can't find a death record. I can't find anything that would back this up as true, except that it turned up in both stories. Maybe there really wasn't Annie Russell. Maybe it's just a story that lovers would tell themselves as they went walking around here. I can just imagine women walking with their sweethearts saying, you know, there was that woman who wanted to marry a guy and he didn't want to marry her. And you saw what happened to her. Hint, hint. You know that whole story, right? That's what happens when a woman wants to marry a guy and he doesn't want to. You know, right? You know how we're going here. Now, do people actually wring their hands? I don't know. Good question. Maybe when they're wet. Well, there is a description of H.H. Holmes from one of his neighbors say he had a habit of winding his fingers as he talked, which means that he literally talked like this. I love that. But also over along the lake shore, this was where the wreck of the Lady Elgin crashed ashore back in 1860. The Lady Elgin was an early steamship that got caught was sailing from Milwaukee to Chicago one day in 1860. It was owned by Gurdon Hubbard, who he comes up on the Graceland Cemetery tour sometimes. Kind of a link between the early Chicago when it was a trading post and the modern city of Chicago. But they were sailing and there were storm clouds and bad visibility. It collided with another ship, and over the course of about half an hour, it sank. A number of people were able to get away. Most of the bodies ended up being, there were about 300 people killed. Most of the bodies ended up being swept out to Winnetka. And this is a picture from about 40 years later. There were still chunks of the Lady Elgin that washed ashore were still places for kids to play along the lake shore. Now, of those people who were killed, about 27 were never identified, and many of them were buried in a mass grave at Rose Hill. Rose Hill tells me that they've triangulated the location where it would have been, but they're not convinced anybody was actually buried there. But there was one particular ghost. Most of the bodies that didn't have a burial place already set up, like the ones who were taken up to Calvary Cemetery in Wisconsin, we saw lots of graves that said Lost on Lady Elgin up at Calvary in Milwaukee. But most of them were buried in a burial ground that they set aside specifically for them in Highwood, which is a little town on the edge of Highland Park. But by the turn of the 20th century, about 40 years later, nobody was quite sure where it was anymore. There was a lot of asking around. Does anybody remember where that burial ground was? By then, reporters who went to find it found that there was like one wooden marker. Everything else had been desecrated by cows. As of a few years ago, nobody was quite sure where it was at all. Now, the Highwood Historical Society claimed in their newsletter that they had figured out where it was, but now the newsletter's offline, so it's difficult to tell anymore. But somewhere in Highwood is this mass burial ground full of unmarked graves, which was said to be guarded by a ghost who would show up anytime construction was going on nearby, like just trying to block people away from it. Obviously, she wasn't that good at the job. But the story went that it was the ghost of a woman who washed ashore a little bit later than some of the other ones, and was found by a witness named Henry Mowers, who told this story later on. He was on the beach the day of the wreck. Days later, this body washed ashore. He said that she was wave-tossed and weather and wind-beaten, but you could see that she was once beautiful, and was still wearing a gold chain and some beautiful rings. So they took the body and locked it into a nearby building until they could alert the authorities. And when they came back, the jewelry was gone. Later on, Mr. Mower said that he saw the necklace on the neck of the wife of a prominent Lake County official. But with the jewelry gone, the body could never be identified. The jewelry was the best chance they had of being able to identify her. But now it was gone. So Mr. Mowers made a coffin himself, and she was buried with the others in Highwood in the now lost cemetery. Really, honestly, the ghost showing up, possibly wringing her hands, as ghosts are wont to do, might be the best way that we could have to find this. This close to Fort Sheridan, a little further up to get to Fort Sheridan. While we're in Winnetka, one of the biggest stories of the early 1880s, and there were enough murders in the 1880s there that people had a lot of stories about it. People would occasionally call it the murder town, particularly after the murder of the Wilsons. Now, right around over here was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Wilson in 1884. Mr. Wilson was a local official, a businessman, and a painter. Their house stood right about here by the railroad tracks. It was moved at one point. But there's actually good pictures of it. It's so unusual. I love it when there's actually a good picture. Now, Mr. James Wilson, this old man, one day came to Mr. McKeague's butcher shop and said, I need a good piece of meat. I've got an old friend coming. I haven't seen him for years, and I want to really entertain him. Now, he lived in here with his wife, Clarissa, who was a political junkie. There was one time when a friend gave her a present that was wrapped in the Chicago Times, the newspaper, and she threw the whole thing in the fire because she didn't want anything that had ever been touched by the Chicago Times in her house. I love this woman. Chicago Times was the horrifically conservative paper. Just this morning I was researching a thing of theirs where a guy had been murdered going to the polls, and they were immediately like, well, he was no angel, you know. And it never really happened anyway. And it probably wasn't because he was trying to vote or anything, and et cetera, all the usual crap. But nobody saw this friend arrive or anything like that, or nobody who knew who this friend might be. But by this time, Mrs. Wilson had lost her mind. She was attended to daily. There were stories about her hoarding eggs that she thought were gold. Every Wednesday, a neighbor would come to keep her company while James went down to Chicago to pick up supplies for his shop. But this time, the helper came and found that the door was locked. She thought, well, that's unusual. They usually leave it unlocked for me. Knocked and there was no answer. So she went inside, and inside she found Mr. Wilson's body, shot through the head and beaten badly over behind the stove. Now, then she went upstairs and found Mrs. Wilson having been killed with her son's Civil War sword. Now, one of the old Winnetka historical books that talked about this said this is a direct result of 1619. In 1619, they first brought enslaved people to the United States. Eventually, there was a war over them, and then she was murdered with a weapon of this war. It's a little bit of a stretch because I don't think the killer would have needed the sword. He probably would have killed her with or without the sword. But then there were stories about the house being haunted for years and years. There were stories about a bloody handprint. There was a bloody handprint that found on the wall, and this ties into a lot of these old urban legend tropes about the handprint or the blood stain that would never wash away. We have several different examples of that scattered around Chicago. There's the Frank Levy firehouse where there was supposedly a handprint on the window from a guy who had died that day. Even more recently, there were some blood stains in a particular stop on one of my ghost tours that were much more recent and didn't wash away for a really long time. Now, the butcher was suspected of the murder. He was the only one who had any information about the Wilsons having a friend coming over or anything. The butcher was a guy by the name of McKeague. This is a picture of him from a video that the Winnetka Historical Society put together. I assume that it's actually him, though it's not that well sourced. In any case, he was eventually acquitted in court. There just wasn't quite enough evidence. They couldn't prove that the buttons found in the scene were buttons from his shirt. They couldn't prove that the hair or the bloodstains were really him. He got out of town after that. A couple of years later, he was shot to death in Church's Ferry, North Dakota, which sounds like the kind of place that would only exist so people could get shot over a card game there. But there were a lot of stories about hauntings here. This is a picture of the Henry Lloyd 1855 house, which was occupied by a journalist in the area whose son founded the Communist Labor Party. But in 1855, it was a well-known haunted place. It was occupied by a ghostly little old lady who went all over the house and didn't really bug the occupants much. But after they moved the house across the street, she still showed up, but not quite as much, and the house is actually still there. Haven't heard anything about it being haunted in a very long time. I thought we might cover like one quick thing. I'll just show you because I got some new footage of this. We'll stay on the north side of Chicago over the side of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 4-part harmony full orchestration. over in this space, we'll walk in here. Now, the fence was taken down lately. I guess they were doing some construction or something. So I figured, that gives me free reign to go walking around and getting some better footage than I previously had. I'm telling the story a lot this month, so you're going to get a really short version tonight. But this is the place where 7 members of the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against the wall and shot, presumably by the Capone gang, on February 14th of 1929. I'm walking right along the place where the bodies would have fallen right here. There are stories about dogs going nuts here, though I've never seen it happen firsthand. But there are also some stories about, they say that if you come out there on a night when there is fresh snow on the ground, and it happens to be Valentine's Day, you will see the outlines of the bodies lying there. Somebody who lived in the house next door, which was standing there at the time of the massacre, even told me, it's really faint, but you can see it. You can see just like a tiny little bit. So I did go out there. I waited and waited for a day when there was fresh snow on the ground that day on Valentine's Day. I went out there, didn't find anything. But I left some snow angels for the next ghost hunter to come around. So, all right, everybody, this takes us right about to the edge. I'm going to plug some of the upcoming stuff. North Shore Ghost Lore, you just saw. Next week, we will be over on the Effing Chicago Facebook page. Still on the regular, the same Twitch and the same YouTube as now, but the software only allows me to stream to one Facebook page at a time. And next week, we're going to go mix it up a little bit, doing on the Effing one, talking about H.H. Holmes, the true history of the White City Devil. There are lots and lots of in-person cemetery tours coming up over the course of the rest of the month. Go to adamchicago.com for links to all of them. Most of them are up on the events page on Facebook now, though I kind of roll those out gradually. But suffice it to say, I'm somewhere just about every weekend day. Among some other ones that are coming up that still have tickets available, October 9th, I'll be at Graceland Cemetery at 11 a.m. Still a few tickets left for that one. And October 15th at Rose Hill Cemetery. This will be route number 1, the one that I've been doing for years. And a couple of weeks after that, we'll do the one that mixes it up a little bit more. So lots of stuff still coming up around here. Thanks so much, especially though, to everybody who showed up for Mystericon 2022. And those of you who are still showing up for the Lincoln Park Zoo tours that I'm doing Tuesdays and Wednesday nights, you can get tickets to that on lpzoo.org. I believe all of the 7 o'clocks are either sold out or pretty close to sold out, but there's still space on the 9 o'clock ones. So do come out for one of those sometime or another. And with that, everybody, we will put the Benny Goodman back on and just hang out for a bit like we always do. Thanks a lot for joining me, especially welcome to anybody new. We do this every Thursday night, most Sunday mornings as well. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, and here is Benny Goodman. Yes, Kathy, I'm doing the haunted history tours of the Lincoln Park Zoo on Tuesday and Wednesday nights. This is my my 5th year doing it now. Kathleen, Bohemian National is not really amenable to tours right now. They used to do flashlight tours, but somebody tripped. All right, Bob, good to hear that. There's always next year. I've already talked to Graceland about a presentation that I want to have there next year. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but I think it would be really fun. And we'll see. I shouldn't plug stuff that I don't know can happen. Hey, Darlene. Yeah, Miles came by a while ago. I held him up a little bit to talk. So he's made his appearance, but I'll find him again. Oh, Lisa, glad to hear that. Bob, good to know. I did find some new stuff for the zoo tour this year. A couple new stories from the staff, a couple new stories from the archives. Katie, I'm sure Priya's around someplace. Priya's on the couch right now. You can see her right there. I just heard her trying to trick Ronnie into giving her an extra round of treats. I'll go find Miles in a minute, certainly before I go. Tiffany, I'll see you at Find a Grave tomorrow as well. I think it's going to be a good one. It's going to be a little bit tricky, but it's a cool story anyway. Marita, was it the honey whiskey? Because that's pretty delicious. The honey is very pronounced in it, and it's probably good for my throat too. We got to remember, I'm only looking at people's like icons here. So I hope I'm not getting that wrong. Octavio, they love the trees. They love those squeezies.
And that would put rhythm in the beat of a wooden Indian.
Yeah, the honey whiskey. It is delicious. I've added some to a flask so I can take it along on tours. Because it's good for my voice. You know, honey. Sure. And then your third streaming video today. Only my... Yeah, also third. Bruce Aiden's having a good sophomore year. Maple whiskey. I've had maple whiskey. The maple was a little too pronounced in it for me. It was like drinking syrup, which is okay. It reminded me of those old like Waffle O's cereal that tasted like syrup. I'm always up for some good 80s cereal reminiscing. Honey whiskeys plus cider, that's a great idea. I know how I'm getting to sleep tonight. Yeah, stay spooky, Debbie. Now let's see what will be the dates for the next Mystericon. I'm already looking ahead too. Let's move up to this October of 23. Looks like it'll probably be September 29th through October 1st. Halloween's a Tuesday that year. Maybe I can talk the Zoo into Family Extra or something.
And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about it.
Joanne, so far the Mystericon, the Find a Grave in person has just been a Mystericon thing. Linda, the Lincoln Park Zoo tours last all through October. Kaboom, yeah, I vaguely remember Kaboom serial. Carol, I have not had much of a chance to watch TV lately. I did watch the new Hocus Pocus. It was, I was a little too old for the first moment it came out, and I'm kind of still in that headset, but it's so much fun watching Bette Midler just chew the scenery like that. She's obviously having a blast. And I have kept up with the new season of Beavis and Butthead, but that's about it. I haven't had the TV on much. I have to remind myself to check web pages that I go to every day. Elaine, I know, right? Have not watched the new Munsters movie. I was never a big Munsters guy to start with. Yeah, I just haven't seen too much. I managed to carve out some time for Hocus Pocus 2. Yeah, I think the new Scooby-Doo is already on Amazon Prime. It hits HBO Max next week. But they are finally having Velma be canonically queer, which they've been hinting at for years. And it was written into the first movie 20 years ago, but it never didn't make the final cut. Well, John, I gotta tell you, when I finally saw the original Hocus Pocus, which was just a few years ago, it also lacked plot. It didn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Amy, I never really have a chance to do the open house stuff. Because I'm always working those weekends. They made it, if you're watching for it in Scooby-Doo Mystery Inc., it's pretty clear there. The show didn't last long enough that they could really explore it, but they made it pretty clear if you're watching for it. Yeah, the guy who was behind the first movie just recently tweeted, the way I wrote it, she was a lesbian in it. By the time we filmed it, it was more implied. By the time it was edited, by the time it was, after the first cut, it was ambiguous. And then by the version that they actually released, it was gone altogether. That guy, I've never been to Salem. I always feel kind of weird going there. It's like, these were not actual witches, you know? Most of them would probably be horrified to know that all this witch stuff was still going on. Now, Shaggy always has the munchies. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a stoner. Scooby eats all of his food. Good night, Gene. But hey, Shaggy would now be pardoned. Well, that's good news. I should probably celebrate. Where's my stash? Yeah, they've joked with the rumors about Scooby and Shaggy being stoners off and on. There's one of the movies where they see like steam coming out of the car, out of the mystery machine, and you hear Shaggy, "Oh, this is primo stuff." They're just cooking up vegetarian burgers.
Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and hear Helen Ward sing.
Lynn, yes, I do. Well, often people ask me, how did I get into this line of work? What inspired me to go into this? And I'm supposed to have this story about I never believed in ghosts until one day. For me, it's one day I turned on Channel 9, and there was this show called Scooby-Doo. And Scooby is one series that can be incredibly hit or miss. Much more miss than hit, honestly, after the first season or so. Now and then they pull out a great one. Carol, it's a north and south street sometimes, and it's an east and west street sometimes. It kind of twists and winds and curves. Thanks, Pammy. I do enjoy this green chair. It's a pretty new addition, but it is very comfortable. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Let me go find Miles. Hanging out this whole time, haven't you? I see you. Hop up. Come on, buddy. Here's the guy. He so enjoyed meeting people this past weekend. Oh, a tree fell on the fence there. Okay.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
There's the guy. Okay. Ouch. I deserve that. Okay. Mystery Inc. was maybe the first Scooby series that was genuinely funny. Kathy, that first day he got in the cat carrier, I haven't had it out where he could get into it since then. But Miles enjoyed meeting people, so I definitely don't think it's out of the question that that'll happen again. Everybody at Graceland was very amused by that today, that I talked to. Karen, of course I still have a Scooby-Doo set. It's over on the Scooby-Doo set is over here. It is set up right there. The Cemetery Action Playset. I wasn't sure how Miles was going to react to being taken out in public, but he loved it. And even like it was a pretty long drive, like taking my parents back to their hotel with him in the car and then all the way back home. That was a pretty good ride. Megan, I don't think it'll happen on the 23rd, so I got 2 tours that day. So we'd have to be there a little bit longer. He didn't mind being at the office. They said he was very good in there. When I came in, he was just curled up sleeping. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around. Thanks to everybody who has hit me up on the Patreon, the Venmo, the PayPal, etc. Well, I see my podcast with Paul Lisnak is now out on WGN Radio. Something on Yahoo News, too. Oh, it's Vintage Chicago Tribune.
We have been presenting the music of Benny Goodman and his orchestra from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel.
A Coolsville Chai. Do they still have those, Alex? Because I want some. I dig Metropolis. There used to be a beatnik hangout. If I'm thinking of the right place, there used to be a beatnik hangout there where Ken Nordine would do his word jazz back in the 50s. But all right, everybody. Benny Goodman is wrapped up. That means it is time for me to wrap up as well. So thanks, everybody, for joining me today. We will be back on Sunday morning. I'll do something quick. I got an 11 o'clock walking tour that day. Still plenty of stuff coming up. Upcoming tours include Next week, remember, we'll be over on the Effing Chicago Facebook page, so I'll be swearing a little bit more. Also, in person, there's still some tickets left for October 9th, which is actually, I believe, yeah, it's 11 a.m. It is 11 a.m. Don't mind me. Then October 15th, we will be at Rose Hill Cemetery. So thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. It wasn't this guy, Jack the Ripper. Yep, you're going to have to log on next week. So thanks for joining me. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I'll be back tomorrow morning for Find a Grave Friday. It's going to be a pretty cool one. So until then, stay safe and stay strong. And of course, if you can, stay spooky, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great night.